Hi, my name is Thomas Kelly, and I'm speaking to you from Chicago, Illinois. Welcome all. The GSD is pleased to present a live online screening of Heinz Emigholz's Goff in the Desert, a cinematic meditation on 62 buildings designed by the American architect Bruce Goff. Goff in the Desert is one installment of a series of films Emigholz has made under the title Architecture as Autobiography. The screening will be preceded by a conversation between Emigholz and curator Anselm Franke. But before I introduce our speakers, allow me to introduce you to Bruce Alonzo Goff, the quintessential outsider architect. Born in 1904 in Alton, Kansas, Goff's family would eventually settle in Tulsa, Oklahoma during its first oil boom. At age 12, Goff began apprenticing for the firm Rush, Endicott and Rush, and by age 21, he had designed and completed 12 buildings. Some of those early Art Deco buildings were the focus of an option studio being taught by Norman Kelly at the GSD this semester. Over the course of his 78 years, Goff would design nearly 500 unique structures across the American Midwest. From a glance, the body of work is loose and disobedient, expansive, and deeply personal. To imagine Goff's work is to imagine a collaboration between Adolf Loos and Jim Henson, an architecture that mystifies geometric order through material fantasy. And while Goff's work is not regularly taught in lecture halls, nor revered within the academy, his legacy should serve as a reminder to us all that authenticity is often found at the margins of society. Goff's trajectory, although separate from the stories we tell ourselves about 20th century American architecture, was absolute. To think carefully about its eclecticism requires time, the kind of time you get when you lose yourself in the desert. For that reason, I am grateful for the work we will be screening today. Now, allow me to introduce our speakers. Heinz Emigholz was born in Achim, near Bremen, Germany in 1948. He has worked as a filmmaker, artist, writer, cinematographer, and producer in Germany and the USA since 1973. In 1974, he began an encyclopedic series of drawings, Die Basis des Make-up, which was the subject of a major exhibition in the Hamburger Bahnhof Gallery in Berlin in 2007-2008. In 1984, he embarked on the Photography and Beyond film series. From 1993 to 2013, he was professor of experimental filmmaking at the Berlin University of the Arts, where he also co-founded the Institute for Time-Based Media and the Art and Media course. He's been a member of the Academy of Arts in Berlin since 2013. Anselm Franke is an author and exhibition maker. He has been head of visual arts and film at Haus der Kulturen der Welt, Berlin since 2013. There, he initiated and curated the exhibitions Neolithic Childhood, Art and a False Present, circa 1930 in 2018 with Tom Hollert, Parapolitics, Cultural Freedom and the Cold War in 2017-2018 with Nita Gauss, Paz Guevara, and Antonia Mahaka, Two or Three Tigers in 2017 with Hyunjin Kim, Nervous Systems in 2016 with Tactical Technology Collective, Stephanie Hankey, Marek Tuzinski, Ape Culture in 2015 with Hyla Peleg, Forensis in 2014 with Forensic Architecture, The Whole Earth with Diedrich Diedrichsen, and After Year Zero with Annette Busch, both in 2013. Anselm previously worked as a curator at KW Berlin and as director of the Extra City Kunsthal in Antwerp. In 2005, he and Stephanie Schulte-Strathaus founded the Forum Expanded for the Berlin International Film Festival, of which he has been co-curator since. He was the chief curator of the Taipei Biennial in 2012 and of the Shanghai Biennial in 2014, and curator of Manifesta 7 in 2008. His exhibition project, Animism, was shown from 2009 until 2014 in collaboration with various partners in Antwerp, Bern, Vienna, Berlin, New York, Shenzhen, Seoul, and Beirut. Franke received his doctorate from Goldsmiths College in London. And before we begin, a couple of housekeeping notes. Those of you who have been using Zoom lately may notice that this webinar has some different features. Please note that the chat function has been disabled so that we all may focus on Heinz and Anselm's conversation. However, the event organizers will use the chat window to share with you a link to watch the screening once the conversation has ended. We will begin with Heinz and Anselm's conversation, and then we will transition to the virtual screening of Goff in the Desert, which will happen through YouTube. Before I turn things over to Heinz and Anselm, please mark your calendars to the virtual screening. Please mark your calendars for a few upcoming lectures in the GSD's virtual public lecture series. On Tuesday, April 21st, we have landscape architect David Moreno Mateos, and on Thursday, April 23rd, film and art historian David Joselit. All lectures will happen on Zoom and require virtual attendees to register. More information about each event, as well as how to register, is available on the GSD's website. Thank you, and let's offer a warm welcome from afar to Heinz and Anselm.
Thank you.
Thank you. So it's a great pleasure to be here today to discuss Goff in the Desert with Heinz Emigholz. I'm going to just briefly describe to you, Heinz, the kind of the overall arch of the questions or the kind of conversation that I've imagined we might have. So I just would like to start you by perhaps saying a few words about the overall position or the specific position of Goff in the Desert in the overall series that Thomas has already mentioned of your architecture films. Before we move on to discuss, the film itself and the work of Bruce Goff in further detail.
Okay, I go ahead. So, Anselm, you asked how this whole thing started. It started actually very early in 1993. I had a project after a series of narrative films. I started a project about, I called Photography and Beyond. And with Photography and Beyond, I meant how do we read human design in our brain? How do we read it? How do we read scripture letters? How do we read sculptures? How do we read drawings? And especially, how do we read three-dimensional objects like architecture? I wanted to do one film. And then I started to film in the 90s. In the middle of the 90s, I filmed Robert Maillat's buildings in Switzerland. I filmed the buildings of Sullivan in the Midwest. And then I made a list. Actually, I made a list already in 93, which architects I really wanted to follow in their lifetime's work. And Bruce Goff was one of them. And I had a list of maybe 10, 12 people. I must say, I made all the films now, but in that time, it was very hard to finance them. So I was able to shoot the Goff film in 2002. We were a team of 3 people. My co-operators were Mai Riegler from Los Angeles. She did the sound, and Uli Etter was doing with me the camera setup. So we were a very small team for a 35mm crew, and we traveled like 12,000 miles through the US, and it took us 6 weeks, and it was quite undertaking. But you asked, how did it all begin? It began with one film I wanted to make. And then when I filmed, I thought, well, it's too long, let's do 2 films. And now actually there are about 80 short and long films about the subject. And I'm continuing with narrative movies now too. So I hope we can hear you now, because there was some kind of interruption. I didn't hear the last part of your question. Can you repeat that? Oh, I think you're, yeah, okay.
Yeah, I'll just return to that quote that I wanted you to comment upon a bit later now. Since you already dived a little bit into the history, let's stick to that for a second. And maybe just recapitulate for us your first encounter with Goff in America. And
yeah.
Yeah, the period that lay between your first encounter and the actual making of the film.
Actually, I encountered him, his work in Los Angeles, the Shinankan Pavilion of Japanese Art in the 80s. It must have been around 86 or 87. I visited the museum. I found this pavilion. I didn't know the names of the architects, Bruce Goff, Prince. I knew nothing about it, but it hit me as something very, very strange, and on the other hand, very close to my kind of thinking about architecture. So I forgot about the building. I didn't even know the name. And then when I started to think about what do you actually want to concentrate on in this film, photography and beyond, I remembered that building, and I did some research, and then I found out there was very little material about Bruce Goff. And I just had one book and so we started to make it a project and think, I want to go there. I want to see it in person, so to say. I want to see it on the premises, because, you know, in architecture photography, they always give you these three photographs that are very representative for the buildings, but actually you don't get a real sense of space because they use wide angle or whatever. So I made it a project to visit them all. And of course, I couldn't go there before to every building. We had to do really a hard research to get all the addresses, to write to people. We didn't get answers sometimes. Sometimes people didn't even know that they were living in a Goff house. And then we just drove there. We drove to New Mexico, to Kansas, to Oklahoma, to Texas, and so forth, and Illinois, of course. So
your initial discovery was not at all that of a learned expert or a scholar. So it must have been something an impression that the building itself, the county museum, the pavilion of the county museum made on you. Can you recall what it was?
Yeah, actually, it's with all my architecture film like that. I don't go to a school book to see what is the most important architect on earth and do a list and film it. But for me, my personal approach to the spaces I see or imagine when I see a photograph is the real start-off point. For example, I was in Santa Monica in a bookshop, and I saw a book about the Banks of Sullivan, and I was so amazed that this kind of building existed, because at the same time I was thinking about ornament and architecture. So it came at the right point when your brain is ready to absorb something. That's a kind of fantastic moment when you see then something on TV. I have to go closer. I have to go there and see it by myself. And so all these films came about like that, even with the Shinankan in Los Angeles. I didn't read Goff's name before in a kind of encyclopedia of architecture. And I would have hardly found him there, because, you know, he was excluded from the official gallery of American architects in those times. Yeah.
Can I just stick to it for one more second? Thomas, in his introduction, has sort of just named a very few, characteristics of Goff's work, and I'd just be interested to hear a little more, both of your personal take on it or experience of it, and maybe the reasons for why he was sidelined, marginalized, or even erased for a long period of time from the official record. So we heard a little bit about this sort of, almost mystical and also mystified, perhaps, experiment with geometry that sometimes has a kind of almost esoteric appeal, but also like the eclecticism. And of course, there's a lot of very different buildings in the film. In fact, it's stunning, the variety of his different signatures.
Yeah, that's actually the wonderful part of it. He had no formula, I would say, like, for example, Bauhaus, it has a certain formula. You actually, when you come up to a building by him, you know exactly it's by him, but you can never envision what it will be because it's so different from every other building you see. So this is very intriguing. I was intrigued by the complicated spaces he built. I think Thomas mentioned Loos too did this round plan idea about different leveled spaces and so on. I'm a cameraman. I always do the camera of my films myself, and as a cameraman, I love complicated spaces. I don't like images like these, what we have here now on the screen, like white walls, one person in the middle, and there's a background, there's a foreground. This is really boring for me when I do the camera. So I think this composing an image for me is what the language of cinema is about. And when I go to a three-dimensional space that I feel connected to, I dive into that space and do a series of shots, and that I think will actually, when we put it together in the editing, reconstruct that complicated space. Loos, for example, I did a film about Loos too, on the same, in the same way, like as a monographical, chronological catalog of his work, so that you can see, like here in Goff's part 2, how he developed. He was a scholar. He, like Thomas said already, first there was Art Deco, then there was a little Bauhaus phase, there was a phase of other American architects, and then around 1940 he dived into his own way of building, and no building is like the other one. And I think because it was so complicated to define his building style, he was really criticized. It was too complicated for some people to go into it and study it and why he did it. And he had good reasons to do what he did. And so no wonder that the international style didn't work with him and Schindler. For me, it's no wonder. Also, he was, of course, supposed to be a queer person, and architects in those days didn't like that at all.
So these are the two reasons that you think made him pushed him to the sidelines for a long time, until today, in fact. No, I just like to pick up on the question of the logic of cinema in relation to that of architecture, because I think that's obviously the really interesting and unique sort of the really interesting question, and the very, very unique form and that you give to it. So maybe we could just very briefly jump to your very early films from the 1970s, where you've began to sort of explore cinema, as you called it, as imaginary architecture in time, and relate it to actual landscapes. So with these kind of scores that you produced, that could in in theory, be reproduced in a completely different site, but where for the concrete films such as Aeroplane, Tide, or Schenectady 1 to 3, were in fact positioned or were embedded in a very concrete landscape. And this very particular inquiry into the relation of the cinematic illusion of movement and the actual site, maybe you could just share a little bit of your thinking and the development of your thinking around these questions.
Well, I was, as a youngster, I started filmmaking when I was about 18 or so. I was very alienated by documentary camera style, like you shoot 24 frames and you project 24 frames. Every kind of realistic movement made me nervous. I didn't believe in film narration anymore. I didn't believe in acting anymore. There was a kind of energy in film that I could only see in certain works of experimental or avant-garde, so-called avant-garde film. Let's say Michael Snow or Ernie Gear or Ken Jacobs or Larry Gottheim, all American filmmakers. So I left Germany to explore more of that. But for me, I did these kind of pixelation film that reconstructed a movement in film for 5 years or so. And then I thought, well, now I did it. I wrote it's like music. You write a big piece. I wrote like Schenectady 3 for me is a big lasting latest piece, and to find out what filmic movement is. And then I was in a way healed and could go back to documentary camera. And then another influence came by studying the Russians, the photography of the Russians. And I saw in the early 20s, Rodchenko and so on. And I thought we have to do it in film too. There's no reason why we use this kind of quadrage or mise-en-scène all the time, or framing. There's no reason. The conventional kind of framing is used up, I would say. Yeah, this was my beginning. And then the documentary work came later when I found it, when I got into the certain kind of cinematography, I saw how well I could use it to depict spaces and reconstruct spaces in film. Yes.
There's something that you once said that I couldn't trace anymore, which I thought was very precise and also yet a real challenge to sort of, conventions of perception, particularly sort of media trained conventions, which is that the gaze itself was a sort of material fact in space. And later you say that in regards to the serious photography and beyond, that it is about a reverse visual process that is analyzed, seeing as expression, not as impression.
Yes, usually.
Can you unpack that a bit?
Yes, usually camera work is seen like you look at something and you depict it. But when you have a frame and you look at something, you have to do a lot of decisions how you film that piece of reality. And that's what I meant with a new kind of cinematography that I was involved in. I was actually able to find new ways to narrate a three-dimensional space. And then it's, of course, your gaze. You look into something and you fix the gaze by doing a certain shot, by composing a certain shot. And so a part of your brain that did all the decisions that come up to that certain image is actually projected into the outside world, and you can see that little part, that part of my brain in form of these decisions there on the screen. So it's not only a passive way. Seeing is not only passive, it's always active too. And that's why it's so important to read images as an active piece of brain there on the screen. Yeah.
In terms of how the films are organized, and also how Goff in the Desert is organized, which shares a lot, but is also specific, like each of the films. Can you explain a little bit this narration question? I mean, it's a film that has no narration in the classical cinematographic sense, or in the sense that one is sort of trained to think of narration today, other than its chronological order, right?
Well, you know, in those days when I started the series, the internet was coming up, or took over as the main media, and documentary film before was something like that, a Gesamtkunstwerk. You show something, you tell the story, there's a speaker, there's a voice of, there's music, there's everything, and everything has to be contained in that film, because there is this, you are the teacher, you teach something to the world. Now, in the internet, it's so easy to get every kind of information, but what it's not easy is to get a real good representation of space and imagery. So that's why I use all the cinema tools like 35mm. I use very good sound systems so that you could envision yourself being in the cinema, being at that set, or in this place that we visited, to make your own decisions. There's nobody who tells you where to look at. Well, there's the gaze, look at this, but there's no body as an intermediary, like somebody running around in the picture telling you what's important or not. You yourself have to make up your mind what is important. And this was possible, I think, because I, in a way, I went back to the beginning of film, where a lot of cinematographers went into the world and made documentary shots and screened these shots to the people who would never have the chance to go there. They were very interested. So in a way, it's like this, very simple, show what is there, like the work of Goff. I have 62 buildings. We see it from a lot of sides. We see his development in his life. And it's very simple. But why is it that I was shocked when I found out that there are no films like that? Because this is the way to get to know something. But all we have is these kind of teachery kind of things where people tell you what you should think about something or not. Make up your own mind. Okay.
Yeah, let's stick to that a little bit, because this is somehow one of the kernels really of your work, and of the particular relationship of the image and the overall architecture of time, the rhythm, the composition, the score, the musical element of your films, in relation to what is mostly absent from the films, which is language, right?
Yeah, mostly. Sometimes there's something. Okay.
At least for certain, it is language in the sense that is now sort of the most common documentary feature, which is a kind of voiceover that explains to you what you see.
Or music, showing the hands of the architecture and this kind of stuff, which I'm not interested in. I'm interested in the noises, in the everything I hear in these places that I film, or in the neighborhood, or of you can't see it, you hear it. A lot of work on my films is done in the sound department, because we recreate the sound of these places, and a lot of information comes through these noises and sounds that you can hear there, and you get a sense of the space. That would be, usually this is just turned down and somebody tells you something. I think every space, even an empty room, has another room tone than another space. So for me, it was very important to get that into the center of the filmmaking. And yeah, like the imagery too. It's not just documentation, of course, it's kind of the composing of these images and sequences are for me like musical songs too. I mean, you could look at this Goff film as an album with songs, and the buildings are the different songs. Yeah.
I think there's a certain tendency today to look at sort of, you know, documentary very much sort of as in opposition, especially in sort of avant-garde purism, in opposition to narrative fiction. And I find it very interesting that in the last few years, if not always, but less visible perhaps, it seems you are completely out there to undo any of these dichotomies, as your architecture films and your documentary methods increasingly become intertwined and tangled, overlapped with your other cinematic work and your feature films, your fiction films.
Yeah, I mean, I really think that if you lose contact to cinematography, I see a lot of documentary films that are full of people say the right things, people say, but the camera is always so terribly conventional that I think, well, is this in a way to speak or what? I mean, you have to put a lot of energy in your cinematography, otherwise you will find no way to tell something different. I see Thomas has some questions here. Shall we go into it or not?
Yeah, I just have a last sort of a last question or something that I think will further illuminate this last set of interests, which is the connection you make between narrative fiction, the organization of memory, ancient memo techniques, and your architecture films. Mm-hmm. So the fact that ancient storytellers, particularly in oral cultures, used buildings, used landscapes as something that is sort of almost prior to the content of the story itself, something that is the source of the story, the source of the thought, and that is extremely fragile. That is not something that is given. So there's an inversion in your films of perspective between that which we normatively perceive as stable and that which we perceive as, you know, eventful, transformative, or fragile, in the sense that exactly that stability that we normally also expect from a building somehow seems to be exactly the most special case, that, you know, almost as if it's happening at the same time in cinematography, right, where in fact we can distort, change the speed of time, change the perception of space. The technology gives us all this possibility, just as our perceptive apparatus might put a lot of effort into stabilizing that which appears as stable to us in space, actual space.
Yeah, for me, see, when you refer to the new narrative movies that I do now, the spaces where we film are absolutely chosen and or built. And I think let's say there are two people having a dialogue. For me, the camera is a third part in the dialogue, and the camera does a connection to the spaces they are acting in. So that we get a very complex situation there, not these 3 shots over the shoulder you see all the time in narrative movies that are so boring and cheating. And so for me, the places where they are, and they change places within sentences. 100 kilometers away, the sentence will continue or so. So I use that as a way of telling stories, bringing in the narrative, bringing in the architecture, bringing in the camera work, and don't hide the camera work. It's a lousy thing to do that. Okay, I think that.
Thank you, Heinz. We'll move to the questions now. So we bring back Thomas.
Yeah.
Thank you, Heinz. Thank you, Anselm. We have a couple questions. So the first one comes via a friend and local artist based here in Chicago. His name is Asaf Evran. He asks, Heinz, in your films, there is, at least for me, a strong tactile feeling, as if you touch the architecture and materials, not with your hands, but with the camera. Can you talk about the physical relationship between body, eye, and architecture?
Yeah, I started to tell that a little bit when we talked about the gaze. I really have to have a feeling. I have a very strange sense of space. Sometimes I think everybody has a different sense of space. I feel nauseated by spaces. I feel lifted up by spaces. I get really nervous in spaces, or I like them, or I really start to hate them. So I have a kind of personal connection to the thing, and I try to, and when I do images that come very fix the gazes I put into these spaces, it's a wonderful work for me, because that's the time when I actually do the connection between me and that space. Yeah, it's not a kind of objectivity I'm striving for, although I think there is no objectivity, but it's about my feeling in that space, and you can see that feeling in the camera work, I think. I hope. Maybe he does, the Chicago guy who asked that question.
Thank you, Heinz. Next, we have a question from one of my studio students. Her name is Bailey Brown. She asks, were you considering ideas of the amateur architect versus the professional architect in the creation of your film? I find it fascinating that Bruce Goff did not go through a traditional architectural education, yet he became an educator later in his career. Do you believe Goff could have created his distinct architectural style if he had participated in a formal architectural education?
Maybe it wasn't available then, and I think he was not an amateur. Well, he loved things, and he loved art, he loved music. But if that is an amateur, okay, that's great. I think he was a highly professional. I mean, I have one anecdote to tell you. I mean, Mies van der Rohe, you know, was one of your founding fathers at your school, and he did this farmer's house in 1948 or 49 or so. In the same area, I think 10 miles away, is a Ford house by Bruce Goff. And actually, I have an old issue of Life magazine where both houses were presented as a new way of building. It was very interesting. And then, you know, Mies had this kind of negative teaching. He brought his students to the Ford house of Goff and said, now I show you how you should not build. And that said somebody who did the farmer's house where nobody can live in. It's too hot or too cold. It's just there. It's a kind of sculpture. But in the Ford house, people live very happily. And so there's some kind of, what kind of teaching? When she asks a question about professional, well, you can get bad teachers and you can get good teachers. And I think the Goff professorship in Norman, Oklahoma had a lot of international influence in Japan and Europe and maybe not in the States, but it's interesting that he was international from the first day on.
And thank you for bringing up the Ford House. I believe that actually answers one of the other questions that we received. Let me ask one more question. This comes from Kyle Winston, more of a technical filmmaking question. Regarding editing, when you go into the post-production process, how often does the story you're thinking of telling turn out to be something else? Does the building as viewed in the sound booth take on a different quality? Are you always seeking to recreate the feeling of being there in the architecture, at the building in the desert, etc.? Or was there an intent at the site maybe motivating the filming?
Well, my main concern is to be open to the object I'm going to film. So I have when I go somewhere, I don't write a script. Now the sun is shining, we are there. No, we take it like it is when it comes, when we go there, and we don't change anything. We do very little artificial light just to enhance what is there. We don't want to do a kind of idealistic view of that building. We want to see it in context. And then I have to react in the editing to that, what I got. I don't go with pre-formed ideas and to show you something because I haven't been there before. So first I have to get the building myself by filming it. And then I edit it the way I think it's right for the object. It comes through what the architect wanted. And so it's not about pre-perception and writing scripts. The script was, I will visit 64 buildings by Bruce Goff. Let's see what it will bring. And you have to be open, and you know, this is the main question in filmmaking. Your brain has to be 100% there on the spot when you film, when you look through the camera, when you decide what to film. Now, when I'm talking to you, my brain is about 30% active, I would say. I don't want to turn this down because I really like to talk to you, but filming is why I think I'm on Earth, yes.
And how about a last question from myself as a segue into the film? It's part technical, but maybe part expansive.
Yes.
The film that everyone is about to see uses oblique framing pretty explicitly to describe Goff's work. As a fan of Claude Perrin and Brian Eno, I'm curious about the power of kind of obliqueness as it relates to this film specifically.
What do you mean by oblique? I'm sorry, I don't understand what you mean.
The frames tend to be angled throughout the film.
Well, but not in special angles. I just dropped the idea that the frame is representative for the gravity line, the side, and this is the horizon. Why do I have to imitate the horizon in my images? Nothing falls out of the image. I mean, but I connect things and I don't care about the right angle. I lost that idea in 75 already, so I can't go back.
Well, that sounds like a good place to stop and transition, I believe, to the screening itself. Anselm, Heinz, thank you so much. If you have any last comments for our audience, we would greatly appreciate it.
Well, what you see is a meditation on spaces. So go into it or leave it. I mean, it's like meditation. Yes, you can meditate architecture. And in this case, very good architecture. Good. Thank you very much there.
This is the quote that I didn't manage to ask Heinz about in the beginning, and I'll just speak it out now without Heinz answering to it. So this is Heinz' voice. Architecture is the most popular mode through which to express human life. With it, you can show all possible breeds of human activity. love, hate, care, loss. You just have to look at it carefully. Thanks, Hans, for this conversation. Thanks to Paige, Ken Stewart, Thomas, and of course, again, to Heinz.
Bye.
Thank you, Heinz. And thank you all. Enjoy the film.